What's the most awkward date you've ever been on? Story 1. I went on a first date to a trendy coffee shop, hoping for good conversation and maybe a connection. When we sat down, he immediately pulled out a thick notebook and said, "I've prepared some questions to help us figure out if we're compatible." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. He opened the notebook and started asking rapid-fire questions. Do you want kids? How many? What are your thoughts on space exploration? I tried to answer politely, but the questions got weirder. He asked if I'd ever been in debt, if I believed in aliens, and even how many pets I wanted in retirement. Then he flipped to another section labeled Deal Breakers and said, I need to know about any bad habits up front. When he asked if I'd ever cheated on a test in school, I excused myself to take a phone call and left. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He brought a notebook full of compatibility questions and deal breakers to a first date. Story 2. The date started on a bad note. He was 40 minutes late and parked his car illegally in front of the restaurant. As he walked up, he waved and said, "Sorry, I don't have much time. I've got court tomorrow for unpaid parking tickets." I laughed nervously, thinking he was kidding. He wasn't. We ordered food, but he kept glancing out the window, clearly distracted. Eventually, I asked what was wrong, and he said, "Oh, I think a tow truck's about to grab my car." Before I could process that, he jumped up, sprinted outside, and moved his car to another illegal spot. When he came back, he shrugged and said, "This happens all the time." By the time we finished eating, I was ready to leave. I paid for my half of the bill, ignored his suggestion to split dessert, and walked out. Story 3. It was a blind date set up by a friend, and I was cautiously optimistic. We sat down, ordered drinks, and started chatting. Within 5 minutes, he said, "Let me show you something," and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his camera roll and started showing me pictures of his ex. "This was us at her sister's wedding," he said, zooming in on their faces. "She always had a great smile." It didn't stop there. He showed me screenshots of their texts, read me parts of their breakup conversation, and even asked, "Do you think I was too clingy?" I was stunned. When I suggested he might not be ready to date, he smiled and said, No, I'm over her. I just thought you'd appreciate the backstory." Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He turned our date into a slideshow of his failed relationship, complete with commentary. Story 4. His profile said he loved food, dogs, and a good sense of humor, so I thought, why not? When he showed up wearing a t-shirt that said, "I'm just here for the free food," I laughed, thinking it was a quirky joke. Then we sat down and he ordered the most expensive steak on the menu. "You don't mind covering this, right?" he asked. "I forgot my wallet." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. The rest of the date was a disaster. He ranted about government conspiracies, claimed the moon landing was fake, and said dogs were probably spies. When the check came, I paid for my half, ignoring his puppy dog eyes, and walked out. He texted later, asking for a second date. If I was feeling generous. Absolutely not. Edit. Too long, didn't read. He forgot his wallet, believed in every conspiracy theory, and thought dogs were spies. Story 5. The date started great. He was charming, polite, and complimented my outfit. But halfway through dinner, he said, "Want to see a magic trick?" Before I could answer, he pulled out a handful of coins and started performing amateur sleight of hand tricks. The coins kept falling onto the floor, and everyone in the restaurant was staring. It didn't stop there. He waved over the waiter and asked if he wanted to participate. The poor guy looked confused as my date pulled out a deck of cards and said, "Pick a card, any card." I finally said, "I think I've seen enough magic for one night," paid my half of the bill, and left before he could try to make himself disappear. Edit. He texted me later, saying, "Next time I'll bring my best tricks." There wasn't going to be a next time. Too long. Didn't read. He turned our date into an embarrassing magic show in a crowded restaurant. Story 6. We met at a cozy little cafe, and things started off promising. He was friendly, funny, and even opened the door for me. But as soon as we sat down, he pulled out a spreadsheet. Yes, an actual spreadsheet. I've been on a lot of dates lately, he said, so I've created a system to rank them. This will help me figure out where we stand. I thought he was kidding, but he opened his laptop and showed me columns labeled personality, appearance, conversation skills, and potential compatibility. He started filling in numbers while asking me questions like, "What's your favorite childhood memory?" and "How do you feel about pets?" I was so stunned I didn't know how to respond. Then he said, "Don't worry, I'll share your score at the end of the date." I excused myself to the bathroom and left. A few hours later, he texted me my score, 72 out of 100, with a note saying, "Room for improvement, but solid overall." Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He ranked me on a spreadsheet during the date and texted me my score afterward. Story 7. The date started late because he texted me from the parking lot saying, "Just give me 5 minutes. I'm changing my shirt." I thought that was a little odd, but I waited. When he finally came in, he was sweating and muttered something about his car being finicky. We ordered drinks, and he immediately launched into a rant about how women these days expect too much from men. I tried to steer the conversation to something lighter, but he kept doubling down. He said, "You're probably one of those girls who wouldn't date a guy without a six-figure income, huh?" I calmly told him that wasn't true, but he interrupted, saying, Sure, that's what they all say." By the time our drinks arrived, I had already decided there wouldn't be a second date. When the waiter asked if we wanted food, I said no and left. Edit. He later texted me saying, "Guess I scared you off with my honesty." No, you scared me off with your bitterness. Story 8. It started like a scene out of a rom-com. He picked me up and took me to a cute outdoor market, where we walked around and tried samples from food vendors. But then he stopped in front of a jewelry booth and said, "Let's test something." Before I could ask what he meant, he pointed to a necklace and said, "Pick one you'd like if we were serious." I awkwardly pointed to a small silver pendant, thinking he was joking. He asked the vendor for the price, then laughed and said, "Wow, you're high maintenance. I could get this online for half the cost." I tried to brush it off, but the date kept spiraling. He joked about how gold diggers ruin good men and asked if I'd ever dated someone for their money. By the end of the day, I was ready to walk myself home. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He used our date to test if I was materialistic, then insulted me for liking a necklace. Story 9. It started normal enough. We met at a nice restaurant, and he seemed charming. But halfway through the appetizers, he leaned in and said, "I have a secret to share. I'm actually royalty." I laughed, assuming he was joking, but he wasn't. He went on to explain that his real name was Prince Xavier of a small, unrecognized European kingdom. He said he'd been hiding in the US to avoid attention, but felt comfortable sharing his true identity with me. I asked a few polite questions, thinking maybe this was some weird icebreaker, but he kept doubling down. He even claimed he had a castle that he couldn't visit because of international politics. I managed to get through dinner, but when he offered to make me a duchess, I declined dessert and called it a night. Edit. He texted me later, saying, "You'll regret not joining me in my kingdom." Still waiting on that regret. Too long. Didn't read. He claimed to be royalty and tried to make me a duchess on our first date. Story 10. We met at a casual diner and things started off fine, until he noticed a table across from us with a couple quietly arguing. He leaned over and said, "This is better than Netflix. Let's narrate their fight." Before I could stop him, he started whispering things like, "Oh, she's mad he didn't do the dishes," and "He's gonna bring up her mother any second now." The couple noticed him staring, and the woman shot him a glare. Instead of stopping, he said loudly, "See, she knows I'm right." The couple got up and left, and I was mortified. He acted like nothing happened, saying, "You gotta enjoy the little things in life." I ended the date as quickly as possible and never answered his follow-up texts. Edit. Too long, didn't read. He turned our date into a live commentary of someone else's argument, and it was as awkward as it sounds. Story 11. We met at a trendy sushi spot, and I was excited. It had been a while since I'd been on a proper date. Everything was going fine until his phone buzzed, and he checked it. "Oh, my ex just texted," he said casually. I thought he was joking, but then he said, "She's asking if we're still on for later. Do you mind if I respond real quick?" I was speechless as he texted her back right in front of me. "Don't worry," he said, noticing my face. "We're just friends now, but we hang out sometimes." He then proceeded to show me their text thread to prove there was nothing romantic going on. At that point, I was ready to leave. He noticed my discomfort and added, "I figured you'd be cool with this. Most girls don't care." I left before dessert. Story 12. I was set up on a blind date by a friend, and at first he seemed sweet. We met at a small Italian restaurant, and I thought, this might actually go well. Then halfway through dinner, he said, "I need to be honest. I brought someone with me." Before I could process what he meant, he pulled out his phone and FaceTimed his mom. "I told her about this date, and she wanted to meet you," he said. His mom smiled and waved, then immediately started asking me questions about my job, my family, and my future plans. I sat there stunned, while he beamed like it was totally normal. I excused myself to use the restroom and left. Later, he texted saying, "My mom really liked you." Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He brought his mom to our date via FaceTime and acted like it was completely normal. Story 13. He seemed perfect, funny, charming, and dressed well. We met at a quiet cafe, and I was genuinely excited. But things got weird fast. As soon as we sat down, he leaned in and said, "You seem nice, so I'm going to be honest. I have a tracker on my ex's car." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "It's not as bad as it sounds," he added quickly. "I just need to know what she's up to. You understand, right?" He then launched into a story about how his ex betrayed him and how he'd been monitoring her for months. I told him I didn't think it was appropriate, but he waved it off, saying, "You'd do the same thing if someone hurt you that badly." I left shortly after, making sure he didn't follow me. Story 14. The date started fine. He seemed normal enough, and we had decent conversation over drinks. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "Do you believe in ghosts?" I thought it was a joke, but his face was completely serious. "I live in a haunted house," he explained. He went on to tell me about the entities that lived with him, how one of them throws things when it's angry, and how he had learned to negotiate with the spirits. I nodded politely, thinking this was just a weird quirk, until he asked, "Would you like to come over and meet them?" I politely declined and ended the date as quickly as I could. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He lived in a haunted house and invited me over to meet his spirits. Story 15. It was a dinner date at a cozy little bistro. Things started well. He was funny, polite, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. Then, halfway through the meal, he leaned in and whispered, "So, I'm actually married, but it's complicated." I froze, unsure of how to respond. "We're technically still together, but we've agreed to see other people," he added. "She doesn't know about this, though, so let's keep it between us." I nearly choked on my drink. I excused myself, saying I needed to use the restroom, paid for my half of the meal, and left. Later, he texted me, saying, "I hope you're not mad. I thought we had a connection." Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He casually admitted he was secretly married and acted like it was no big deal. Story 16. I met him at a popular burger joint, and everything seemed fine at first. He was funny and charming, and I started thinking this might actually go well. Then, out of nowhere, he leaned in and said, "I've got something cool to show you." He pulled out a small black case and opened it to reveal a collection of lockpicks. I stared at him, not knowing how to respond. "It's just a hobby," he said, laughing at my expression. "I'm really good at it. Want me to demonstrate?" He then pointed to the restaurant's bathroom door and said, "I bet I could open that in 30 seconds. I quickly told him no, but he kept going on about how fascinating locks were and how much money he'd saved by picking locks instead of calling a locksmith. When he started talking about how he'd once accidentally broken into someone's garage just to test his skills, I knew it was time to leave. I paid for my half of the meal and left before he could offer to show me more tricks. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He brought lockpicks to our date and thought breaking into things was an acceptable conversation topic. Story 17. He seemed normal. Nice smile, good manners, and a great sense of humor. We met at a quiet Italian restaurant, and the first half of the date went surprisingly well. Then, as we were finishing our entrees, he said, "I think we should talk about finances." I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. He pulled out a printed budget spreadsheet and said, "I like to plan ahead. If we were to start dating, I'd need to know your income, your spending habits, and how much debt you have." I laughed nervously, but he kept going, asking if I was comfortable with saving 30% of my income each month. When I told him I wasn't interested in sharing my financial details on a first date, he said, "It's not a big deal. I'm just trying to see if we're compatible." I excused myself to the bathroom and left, shaking my head the whole way home. Story 18. We met at a local cafe for a casual coffee date, and everything seemed fine at first. Then, as we were chatting, he pulled out his phone and said, "Want to see something funny?" He opened a group chat with his friends and showed me screenshots of other women's dating profiles, complete with his sarcastic comments about their pictures. "She's trying too hard," he said, pointing to one. "And this one? Total catfish." I was horrified, but tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. Instead, he asked, "What's the worst profile picture you've seen? I bet you've swiped left on some real disasters." I told him I wasn't comfortable talking about other people like that, but he just laughed and said, "Don't be so uptight. It's all in good fun." I finished my coffee as quickly as possible and left. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He spent our date mocking other women's dating profiles and thought it was hilarious. Story 19. He picked me up for dinner and everything seemed fine until we got to the restaurant. As soon as we sat down, he started criticizing the menu. "This place is overpriced," he said loudly enough for the waiter to hear. "I don't know why people like it." When the food arrived, he took one bite and called the waiter over to complain. "This steak is overcooked," he said, "and the sides are cold." I was mortified as the waiter apologized and offered to replace his meal. He didn't stop there, though. He made a point of loudly commenting on how incompetent the staff seemed and how he could cook better food at home. I tried to change the subject, but he kept ranting. By the end of the meal, I'd barely touched my food and was desperate to leave. He didn't offer to pay for my half of the meal and didn't apologize for his behavior. Edit. He texted me later saying, "I'm surprised you didn't say anything about the terrible service. Guess I was the only one with standards." No, thanks. Story 20. We met at a fancy steakhouse for our first date, and I was excited. He seemed charming and well-dressed, and the conversation started off great. Then, halfway through dinner, he leaned in and said, "So, I need to tell you something. I've been banned from this restaurant before." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. "It was a misunderstanding," he said. "They caught me trying to take leftovers off someone else's table after they left. I hate wasting food." I didn't know what to say, so I awkwardly changed the subject. But then he added, "If we're lucky, they won't recognize me tonight." The rest of the meal was painfully awkward, as I kept waiting for the staff to confront him. When the check came, he asked if I'd mind paying for both meals since he'd forgotten his wallet. I paid for my half and left, vowing never to go back to that restaurant again. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He was banned from the restaurant for taking other people's leftovers and made me pay for my own meal. Story 21. We met at a nice Japanese restaurant and I was optimistic. He seemed polite and friendly, but as soon as the waiter brought out the menus, he started acting strange. "Do you trust me to order for you?" he asked. I hesitated but said sure, thinking maybe he was a foodie. When the food arrived, he made a big show of explaining each dish, talking like a chef on a cooking show. "This is the finest sushi you'll ever eat," he said, watching me closely as I took a bite. Then he asked, "Aren't you going to thank me?" I laughed nervously, but he wasn't joking. "I just created the perfect dining experience for you," he said. When the bill came, He stared at it for a long time and then said, "I think it's fair if we split this since I did all the work of choosing the food." I paid my half and left, grateful I didn't let him pick anything else for me. Story 22. It started off promising. He was funny, charming, and even held the door open for me when we met at a small cafe. But halfway through the date, he leaned in and said, "You seem like a really chill person, so I think you'll be cool with this." He then pulled out his phone and showed me his follower count on Instagram. "I'm kind of a big deal online," he said, sliding his phone across the table so I could see his profile. He went on to explain how he was building a personal brand and asked if I'd be willing to take some pictures of him after our date. "You've got a good eye," he said. "I can tell." When I politely declined, he sighed and said, "It's fine. I'll just use my tripod." The rest of the date consisted of him scrolling through his own photos and asking me which ones I thought were his best. Edit. Too long, didn't read. He turned our date into a pitch for his social media career and wanted me to be his unpaid photographer. Story 23. We met at a quiet wine bar, and everything seemed great at first. He was polite, had a good sense of humor, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. But about 20 minutes in, he casually said, "By the way, I invited a friend to join us. I hope that's okay." Before I could respond, his friend showed up, a guy who looked just as confused as I felt. Apparently, my date had invited him to get his opinion on me. "Don't worry," he said, laughing. "He's just here to give me some honest feedback." The friend sat down, awkwardly sipping a drink, while my date kept asking him questions like, "What do you think of her laugh?" and "Do you think she seems trustworthy?" I excused myself to the restroom and left, texting my date to let him know I wasn't interested in being part of his weird experiment. Story 24. He picked me up for dinner, and everything seemed fine, until we got in the car. The radio was blasting what I can only describe as heavy death metal, and he was headbanging the whole time. When I asked if we could turn it down, he said, "Oh, you're not into this. You'll learn to love it." At the restaurant, he spent 10 minutes talking about how much he hated mainstream music and how he was in a band that was too real for the industry. Then he handed me a CD. "This is our demo," he said. "I think it'll change your life." I politely took it, but when he asked if I could listen to it right then on my phone, I told him I didn't have headphones. He insisted on driving me home afterward, but only if I promised to give the demo an honest listen. I walked home instead. Edit. Too long, didn't read. He turned our date into a death metal sales pitch and gave me his band's demo. Story 25. It was supposed to be a simple coffee date, but he showed up 15 minutes late, sweating and carrying a large duffel bag. "Sorry," he said, plopping it down on the chair next to him. "I came straight from practice." I asked what kind of practice, and he grinned, unzipping the bag to reveal a collection of foam swords. "LARPing," he said proudly. "Live action role-playing. I'm a knight." I tried to sound supportive, saying it sounded fun, but he took it as an invitation to explain the entire backstory of his character. By the time he started reenacting a sword fight with an imaginary opponent, I was ready to leave. He offered to let me join the kingdom if I came to his next practice. I politely declined and told him I wasn't into role-playing. Edit. To his credit, he was very passionate about his hobby. Too long. Didn't read. He brought foam swords to our coffee date and tried to recruit me into his imaginary kingdom. Story 26. We met at a fancy rooftop bar, and I was excited. He seemed charming over text, and even offered to pick the place. Things started well until he leaned in and said, "So, I have a theory." I braced myself, but I wasn't ready for what came next. "I think the moon landing was staged," he said with complete seriousness. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he went on to explain his research. He pulled out his phone and showed me a folder of screenshots, grainy photos, conspiracy theory articles, and even a diagram he'd made himself. "Look at the shadows," he said, zooming in. "They don't match up." I tried to steer the conversation back to something normal, but he kept doubling down. "You can't trust the government," he said. "Next, they'll tell us the earth is round." That's when I realized he wasn't joking. I finished my drink, told him I wasn't feeling well, and left. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He spent our date proving the moon landing was fake and nearly convinced me the Earth might be flat. Story 27. It was a dinner date at a small cozy bistro. Everything started great. He was funny, attentive, and even complimented my choice of wine. Then, as the appetizers arrived, he leaned in and said, "You seem like a smart person, so I think you'll understand." I nodded, expecting him to share something personal. Instead, he said, "I've been researching how to live off the grid." He then launched into a detailed explanation of his plan to build a cabin in the woods, complete with solar panels, rainwater collection systems, and no government interference. I tried to sound interested, but he kept asking questions like, "Do you think you could go without electricity?" And "How do you feel about hunting your own food?" By the time dessert arrived, he was showing me blueprints he'd sketched for his future homestead. When he asked if I'd be interested in learning how to gut a fish, I decided it was time to go. Edit. He texted later saying, "You'd make a great partner for off-grid living." I politely disagreed. Story 28. We met at a casual diner, and things seemed fine until he pulled out a giant Tupperware container. "I meal prepped this week," he explained, ignoring the menu. "I don't believe in wasting money on restaurants." I awkwardly ordered a sandwich while he opened his container of cold pasta and vegetables. He pulled out a fork from his pocket and started eating like this was completely normal. The waiter looked confused but didn't say anything. I tried to make conversation, but he kept talking about his money-saving hacks, like reusing tea bags and unplugging his fridge to save on electricity. When the bill came, he laughed and said, "At least I won't have to split this." I paid for my meal and left, wondering why he didn't just ask me to go on a picnic instead. Story 29. He picked me up in an old beat-up car that smelled faintly of gasoline. "Sorry about the mess," he said as I climbed in. The back seat was piled with tools, fast food wrappers, and what looked like a partially disassembled lawnmower. We were supposed to go to a movie, but halfway there, the car started making a strange noise. "Don't worry," he said, pulling over. "I've got this." He popped the hood and spent the next 20 minutes trying to fix the engine, while I stood awkwardly on the side of the road. When he couldn't figure it out, he called a friend to pick us up. Instead of apologizing, he laughed and said, "This is kind of an adventure, isn't it?" By the time his friend arrived, I had decided there wouldn't be a second date. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. His car broke down mid-date, and I ended up hitching a ride with his friend. Story 30. We met at a trendy vegan cafe, and I was looking forward to trying something new. As soon as we sat down, though, he started grilling me about my diet. "Do you eat meat?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. When I said yes, he looked genuinely offended. For the next 20 minutes, he lectured me on the ethics of eating animals, the environmental impact of dairy farming, and how meat eaters are destroying the planet. I tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics, but he kept coming back to it. When our food arrived, he stared at my plate of avocado toast and said, "You know, even avocados are problematic. The water usage alone is insane." I spent the rest of the meal nodding politely and planning my exit. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He turned our date into a lecture on food ethics and judged everything I ate. Story 31. We agreed to meet at a casual bar for drinks, and things started off well. He was funny, polite, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. About halfway through the date, though, he leaned in and said, "I've got a confession to make. This isn't my first date tonight." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. "I like to schedule back-to-back dates to maximize my time," he explained, like it was the most logical thing in the world. He went on to tell me about the girl he'd met earlier that evening, rating her on her conversation skills and sense of humor. Then he asked, "How do you think you're doing so far?" I was so stunned I didn't know what to say. When the check came, he looked at me expectantly, and I said, "You should probably save your money for date number 3. I paid for my drink and left. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He scheduled multiple dates in one night and wanted me to compete for a second round. Story 32. We met at a cozy little Italian restaurant, and at first, Everything seemed great. He was charming, attentive, and made me laugh. But as soon as the waiter came to take our order, he said, "Actually, I'd like to order for both of us." I raised an eyebrow, but let it slide, thinking maybe he had a sweet gesture in mind. Instead, he ordered 2 salads and a shared plate of spaghetti. "It's Lady and the Tramp style," he said, grinning. When the food arrived, he insisted we eat from the same plate, twirling noodles onto both of our forks and watching me closely as I ate. Then he said, "Now for the best part," and leaned across the table, holding a single strand of spaghetti in his mouth. "Come on," he said, gesturing for me to take the other end. I laughed nervously and said, "I think I'm good." He looked genuinely disappointed and spent the rest of the meal sulking. Edit. Too long, didn't read. He recreated the Lady and the Tramp spaghetti scene on a first date, and I wasn't into it. Story 33. It started as a nice walk in the park, a low-key first date idea I actually appreciated. We chatted about work, hobbies, and favorite places to travel. Then he suddenly stopped, looked at me seriously, and said, "Do you believe in past lives?" I wasn't sure where he was going with this, but I said, "I guess it's possible." His eyes lit up, and he said, "I knew it. I feel like we've met before. In another life, you were probably my queen." I smiled awkwardly, unsure how to respond. For the rest of the date, he kept referring to me as "Your Majesty" and telling me stories about how we'd ruled the kingdom together centuries ago. When I tried to change the subject, he said, "You're probably just not ready to remember yet." I ended the date early, thanking him for the unique experience. Story 34. We met for coffee at a quaint little cafe, and everything seemed fine, until he showed me his binder. "This is my collection," he said, sliding it across the table. Inside were dozens of laminated pictures of rare coins. "I've been collecting for years," he explained. I nodded politely, thinking it was an interesting hobby, but he wasn't done. He launched into a detailed explanation of each coin's history, its value, and how he'd outbid people at auctions to get them. Then he asked, "Do you collect anything?" I said no, and he frowned. That's a shame. I was hoping to meet someone who shares my passion for preservation. The rest of the date was a one-sided conversation about coin grading and market trends. By the end, I knew more about rare pennies than I ever wanted to. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. He brought a binder of rare coins and turned the date into a numismatics lecture. Story 35. It was supposed to be a casual dinner date, but as soon as I got in his car, I knew something was off. The back seat was filled with camping gear, and there was a map spread out on the passenger seat. "Change of plans," he said with a grin. "I thought we could go on an adventure instead." I asked where we were going, and he said, "You'll see. It's a surprise." Alarm bells started going off in my head, but I tried to stay calm. After driving for about 20 minutes, he pulled into a dirt parking lot near a wooded area and said, "We're here." Apparently, his idea of a date was hiking to a remote spot to connect with nature. I told him I wasn't dressed for hiking, but he insisted, saying, "It'll be fun, trust me." I refused to get out of the car and asked him to take me back. He seemed annoyed but eventually turned around. Edit. Too long, didn't read. He turned our dinner date into a surprise hiking trip in the woods, and I wasn't having it. Story 36. We met at a nice Mediterranean restaurant, and things started off well. He was polite, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. But halfway through the meal, he leaned in and said, "I have a confession to make. I've been kicked out of 3 gyms this year." I thought he was joking, so I laughed. But he wasn't. He went on to explain how he'd argued with staff over unfair rules, and once got into a fight with another gym member over a machine. "People just don't get me," he said, shaking his head. "I'm passionate about fitness." As I tried to steer the conversation back to something normal, he started flexing his arms and asked, "Do you think I look like I've missed a leg day?" I smiled awkwardly and finished my meal as quickly as possible. Story 37. He suggested meeting at a dog park, which I thought was adorable because I love dogs. But when I showed up, he didn't have one. I don't own a dog, he said casually. I just like hanging out here because it's a great way to meet people. He then spent the next 20 minutes awkwardly petting strangers' dogs and asking their owners weirdly specific questions like, "Do you think golden retrievers are happier in colder climates?" At one point, he even picked up a stick and tried to get someone else's dog to fetch it. I left before he could embarrass himself any further. Story 38. We met at a sushi bar, and I was impressed by how confident and charming he seemed. But as soon as the waiter came to take our order, he started talking like he was on a reality cooking show. "We'll start with the toro sashimi," he said, waving his hand dramatically, "and then move into the dragon roll to balance the flavors." When the food arrived, he insisted on describing every dish in detail, as if he'd prepared it himself. "This tuna is buttery with just the right amount of umami," he said, gesturing like a sommelier. I tried to eat quietly, but he kept asking, "What do you think? Am I right about the texture?" By the end of the meal, I felt like I'd been part of a bad food critique show. Story 39. The date started with him suggesting a quick coffee, which I thought was great for a first meeting. But as soon as we sat down, he pulled out a stack of papers and said, "This is my bucket list. Let's see how many things we have in common." He went through the list item by item, pausing after each one to ask, "What about you? Would you skydive? What's your stance on bungee jumping? Would you climb Everest?" I tried to play along, but it felt like I was being interviewed for an adventure club I didn't apply to. When he asked if I'd consider moving to Antarctica to study penguins, I politely told him I wasn't sure and left shortly after. Story 40. We met at a casual diner, and things seemed fine at first. But as soon as the food arrived, he said, "Let me show you something cool." He pulled out a small flask and started pouring whiskey into his soda. "I never pay for overpriced drinks," he said proudly. He then pulled out a second flask and offered it to me, saying, "It's vodka, great for mixing." I declined, and he looked genuinely offended. "Suit yourself," he said, shrugging. For the rest of the meal, he loudly complained about how restaurants overcharge for everything and how he was sticking it to the system. When the bill came, he suggested we dine and dash, laughing like it was a joke. I paid my half and left before he could actually try it. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. These dates included a guy kicked out of gyms, a dogless dog park visitor, a wannabe food critic, a bucket list interrogator, and someone who brought flasks to a diner. Dating can be wild. Story 41. We met at a charming cafe for what I thought would be a relaxed first date. As soon as we sat down, he started asking rapid-fire questions. "Do you believe in astrology? What's your zodiac sign? How do you feel about moon phases?" I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. He pulled out a small notebook and started charting my birth date, asking for the exact time and location I was born. "I need this to see if we're cosmically compatible," he said seriously. I went along with it, curious about what he'd say. After a few minutes of intense scribbling, he looked up and said, "This isn't great. Your rising sign clashes with my Venus." I didn't know how to respond, so I said, "Well, maybe that's just one interpretation." He sighed dramatically and said, "I'll think about it, but I don't know if I can date someone with such chaotic energy." I excused myself to take a call and never went back. Story 42. It was a casual dinner date, and at first everything seemed fine. But as soon as the waiter brought the bread basket, he leaned in and whispered, "Don't eat that. It's a scam." Confused, I asked what he meant, and he launched into a full-blown rant about how restaurants use bread to trick customers into eating less of the expensive food. He spent the rest of the meal pointing out other tricks the restaurant was allegedly using, like small plate sizes and dim lighting. "It's all psychology," he said. "They think we're too stupid to notice." By the time dessert came around, I was exhausted. When the check arrived, he scrutinized it like a detective, muttering about hidden fees before reluctantly paying his half. Story 43. We went to an outdoor movie screening, and I thought it was a fun, low-pressure idea for a first date. He brought a picnic blanket, snacks, and even a thermos of hot chocolate. But as soon as the movie started, he pulled out his phone and began recording it. At first, I thought he was just taking a quick clip to share on social media, but he kept recording, scene after scene, whispering to himself about the lighting choices and cinematography. I finally asked what he was doing, and he said, "I'm documenting this for my YouTube channel. I review movies." When I suggested it might be distracting to the other people, he shrugged and said, "Art needs to be critiqued." By the end of the movie, people were glaring at us, and I was mortified. Story 44. We met for coffee, and at first everything was going well. But as soon as I mentioned my job, he leaned forward and said, "I could teach you how to retire by 30. Intrigued, I asked him to explain, and he pulled out a spiral notebook filled with charts, graphs, and what looked like a PowerPoint presentation. For the next 30 minutes, he talked non-stop about cryptocurrency, passive income, and the secrets of financial freedom. When I tried to change the subject, he said, "No offense, but your priorities are all wrong. You're wasting your potential." He then handed me a business card and said, "Call me when you're ready to get serious about your future." I politely declined and ended the date early. Story 45. He suggested a bowling alley for our first date, which I thought was fun and casual. But as soon as we got there, he said, "I hope you're ready to be humiliated." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. He spent the entire game trash-talking every move I made, celebrating his strikes like he'd won an Olympic medal, and even yelling, "Loser!" every time I missed a pin. When I finally got a strike, he accused me of getting lucky and refused to high-five me. By the end of the game, he had scored double my points and wouldn't stop talking about how dominant he was. "Do you want a rematch?" he asked smugly. I declined and told him I had an early morning. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. These dates included a zodiac-obsessed chart maker, a conspiracy theorist about bread, a wannabe movie critic, a cryptocurrency salesman, and a sore winner at bowling. Dating is a wild ride. Story 46. We met at a cozy Italian restaurant, and I was optimistic. He seemed polite and well-spoken. But the moment the waiter came to take our order, he said, "I hope you don't mind, but I'm fasting." Confused, I asked if he was sure he wanted to meet at a restaurant. "Oh, it's fine," he said. "I just enjoy the smell of food." For the rest of the date, he watched me eat while sipping a glass of water. "How's the pasta?" he asked, leaning in to sniff my plate. I tried to make light conversation, but he kept asking detailed questions about the food. "Is the sauce creamy? Do you think the garlic is fresh?" It felt less like a date and more like a cooking show. When the bill came, he laughed and said, "Well, at least mine is easy to calculate." I paid for my half and left, relieved to finally eat in peace. Story 47. He invited me to an arcade for our first date, which I thought was a fun and unique idea. But as soon as we got there, he turned into a competitive monster. "I'm undefeated at skee-ball," he declared, dragging me to the nearest machine. For the next hour, he insisted we compete at every game, from air hockey to racing simulators. He trash-talked every time I lost and celebrated every win like he'd conquered the world. When I finally beat him at basketball, he sulked and said, "The hoops are rigged." By the end of the date, I was exhausted. As we were leaving, he asked if I wanted to join his competitive gaming league. I told him I'd think about it and never replied to his follow-up texts. Story 48. It was a simple coffee date, and everything started off fine. We chatted about work, hobbies, and travel plans. But then he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" I said sure, expecting a light-hearted question. Instead, he asked, "What's the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to you?" I froze, unsure of how to respond. "You can tell me," he said, leaning forward earnestly. "I'm really good at helping people unpack their feelings." I tried to laugh it off, but he kept pushing, saying, "I think vulnerability is the key to a strong connection." When I said I wasn't comfortable sharing something so personal, he looked disappointed and said, "Well, this was a missed opportunity." I quickly finished my coffee and left, feeling more drained than I ever had after a first date. Story 49. We met at a burger joint, and things seemed normal. At first, but then he pulled out his phone and said, I'm really into documenting my life. Do you mind if I vlog this? Before I could answer, he started recording, introducing me to his audience. Hey guys, this is my date with Sarah, he said, panning the camera over to me. I waved awkwardly as he narrated our conversation, giving commentary on my answers to his questions. At one point he said, comment below if you think she seems cool so far. When the food came, he took a full 5 minutes to photograph and film it from every angle. By the time I took my first bite, he was already editing clips on his phone. I told him I wasn't comfortable being part of his vlog, and he seemed genuinely surprised. But my followers love this kind of content, he said. I left shortly after. Story 50. He suggested a small art museum for our first date, which I thought was a great idea. But as we walked through the galleries, he started critiquing every piece of art like he was on a judging panel. This composition is amateur, he said, pointing to a painting. The artist clearly doesn't understand color theory. When I mentioned that I liked one of the sculptures, he scoffed and said, You're joking, right? It's so derivative. He then spent 10 minutes explaining why my opinion was objectively wrong. As the date went on, he grew more insufferable, loudly critiquing every piece we passed and ignoring my attempts to steer the conversation elsewhere. By the end of the date, I was exhausted and told him I didn't think we were a good match. That's fine, he said. Art is my true love anyway. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. These dates included a fasting food enthusiast, a hyper-competitive gamer, an overzealous therapist, a wannabe influencer, and an unbearable art critic. Sometimes, staying home is the better option. Story 51. We met at a quiet cafe, and everything seemed fine, at first. He was polite and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. Then, halfway through the date, he asked, Do you believe in aliens? I thought it was a quirky icebreaker, so I said, Sure, why not? That's when he leaned in and said, Good, because I've been abducted before. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his face was dead serious. He proceeded to tell me a detailed story about how he'd been taken by beings of light, who communicated telepathically, and showed him the future of humanity. I tried to steer the conversation back to something normal, but he kept bringing it back to his experience, even asking if I'd ever seen strange lights in the sky. When I said no, he sighed and said, You're probably just not ready to remember. I finished my drink quickly and left. Story 52. He suggested a retro diner for our first date, which I thought was a cute idea. But as soon as we sat down, he said, I need to tell you something. I don't believe in tipping. I froze, unsure of how to respond. He continued, I think tipping is a scam. These places should pay their workers better, instead of expecting us to make up the difference. I tried to explain that servers rely on tips, but he waved me off and said, They chose this job. Throughout the meal, he loudly complained about the prices and the service, even though our waiter was perfectly nice. When the check came, I left cash for the tip, but he scoffed and said, You're enabling the system. I didn't stick around to argue. Story 53. We met at a cute little bakery, and I was excited to try their famous pastries. He seemed friendly enough at first, but as soon as we ordered, he said, Do you know how many calories are in that? I laughed awkwardly, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. That's like your entire daily limit, he added. Throughout the date, he kept making comments about my food choices. When I ordered a second cup of coffee, he said, You know caffeine isn't great for your skin. By the end of the date, I felt more judged than I ever had in my life. As we were leaving, he said, I'd love to go out again. Next time, I can help you make healthier choices. I smiled politely and said, I'll think about it. I didn't. Story 54. We met for a simple coffee date, and everything seemed normal at first. Then he pulled out his phone and said, I'm going to start recording. I hope that's okay. Confused, I asked why, and he said, I like to document all my first dates. It's for personal growth. Before I could respond, he started narrating. So here we are, first date with Sarah. Things are going well so far. He then turned the camera toward me and asked, How do you think the date is going? I awkwardly said, Fine, I guess. and tried to laugh it off, but he kept filming. When I told him I wasn't comfortable being recorded, he seemed offended. "I just think it's important to reflect on these moments," he said. I ended the date early and told him to delete the footage. Story 55. He suggested a karaoke bar for our first date, which I thought was a fun idea. But as soon as we got there, he signed us up for a duet without asking. "We're doing Don't Stop Believin'," he said excitedly. When our turn came, he completely took over, belting out the lyrics at full volume and improvising dance moves. He barely let me sing a single word. The crowd was laughing, not with us, but at us, and he seemed oblivious. After our performance, he said, "Wasn't that amazing? We're like the perfect team." He signed us up for another song, but I told him I wasn't feeling well and left before it was our turn again. Edit. Too long, didn't read. These dates included an alien abduction believer, an anti-tipper, a calorie counter, a date documentarian, and a karaoke hog. You can't make this stuff up. Story 56. We met at a cozy pizza place, and everything started out great. He was funny, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. But as soon as the pizza arrived, he got weird. "I need to do something first," he said, pulling out a small food scale. I watched in shock as he carefully weighed each slice of pizza before putting it on his plate. "I track all my meals," he explained. "This helps me stay disciplined." I tried to laugh it off, but he wasn't done. He pulled out his phone, opened the calorie tracking app, and entered every ingredient on the pizza: cheese, pepperoni, even the basil leaves. When I tried to change the subject, he said, "You should try it. It's life-changing." By the end of the meal, I felt like I'd just been on a date with a fitness coach instead of a potential partner. Story 57. He suggested a dinner date at a nice restaurant, and I was excited. It had been a while since I'd been on a proper date. Things started fine until he leaned in and said, "I hope you don't mind, but I brought a surprise." I thought he meant a gift, but then he pulled out a deck of tarot cards. "Let's see if we're compatible," he said, shuffling the deck. He laid out the cards between bites of his steak, explaining what each one meant. When he flipped over the tower card, he frowned and said, "This isn't good. It could mean disaster." I laughed nervously, but he looked genuinely concerned. "We might not be destined for each other," he said dramatically. By the time dessert arrived, he was asking if I believed in soulmates and whether I'd ever had my aura cleansed. I politely ended the date and told him I wasn't ready for a reading. Story 58. We met for a casual lunch at a trendy sandwich shop, and everything seemed fine until he started critiquing the decor. "This place has no identity," he said, pointing to the mismatched chairs. "Are they trying to be rustic or modern? They need to pick a lane." When our food arrived, he dissected his sandwich like a scientist. "The bread ratio is all wrong," he said, "and the lettuce is wilted. Did they even try?" I tried to steer the conversation towards something positive, but he kept complaining about everything: the music, the lighting, even the shape of the plates. By the end of the meal, I was exhausted. When he asked if I wanted to grab coffee afterward, I politely declined and went home to eat a snack in peace. Story 59. He invited me to a comedy club, which I thought was a fun and low-pressure idea. But as soon as the show started, he began whispering critiques about every comedian. "This guy's timing is off," he said, and her punchline was way too predictable. He laughed at his own jokes louder than at the actual comedians, and when the headliner came on, he muttered, "I could do better than this." After the show, he spent 20 minutes ranting about how comedy has lost its edge and how he'd blow people away if he ever got on stage. When he asked if I'd come to one of his open mic nights, I told him I didn't think we were a good match. Story 60. We went to a quaint bookstore cafe for our first date, and I was thrilled. It seemed like such a thoughtful idea. As we browsed the shelves, he picked up a book and said, "I've already read this, but you should. It's a classic." I thanked him and put it back, but he frowned. "No, seriously, you have to read it. It'll change your life." He spent the next hour insisting I buy several books he recommended, explaining how each one would fix a part of my personality. When I told him I wasn't ready to commit to buying anything, he sighed and said, "Well, you're missing out." Over coffee, he continued to push the idea that reading these books would make me a better person. By the end of the date, I felt like I'd sat through a lecture. Edit. Too long, didn't read. These dates included a pizza-weighing enthusiast, a tarot card reader, a Dacre critic, a wannabe comedian, and a self-proclaimed life coach via books. Some people just can't turn off their quirks. Story 61. We met at a charming seafood restaurant, and I was optimistic. He seemed confident and well-spoken in our messages. As soon as we sat down, though, he said, "Just so you know, I'm on a very specific diet. I'll be ordering off menu." When the waiter came, he launched into a detailed request: grilled salmon with no oil, steamed vegetables, and a side of plain rice. "And don't add any seasoning," he said. The waiter nodded patiently, but then my date added, "Also, can you check with the chef to make sure there's no cross-contamination with butter or sauces?" I ordered something simple to avoid drawing attention, but he stared at my plate like it offended him. "Do you know how much sodium is in that?" he asked. I tried to laugh it off, but he kept making comments about my food choices. When the bill came, he said, "I think it's fair if you pay more since your meal cost more than mine." I paid my half and left, wondering how someone could make eating feel like a chore. Story 62. He suggested meeting at a trivia night, which I thought was a fun idea. But as soon as the game started, he became intensely competitive. "We need to focus," he said, shushing me when I tried to make small talk. He answered most of the questions himself, barely giving me a chance to participate. When I did try to contribute, he corrected me loudly, saying, "No, that's wrong. It's definitely C." At one point, when we got a question wrong, he actually groaned and said, "Ugh, I knew I should have come alone." By the end of the night, he was glaring at the winning team and muttering about how the questions were biased. I told him I wasn't interested in another date, and he said, "Fine, I need a smarter teammate anyway." Story 63. We met at a cozy wine bar, and I thought the setting was perfect for a first date. But as soon as we sat down, he pulled out a notebook and said, "I've been working on a screenplay. Can I read you a scene?" I hesitated, but before I could respond, he opened the notebook and started reading. It was a dramatic monologue about a tortured artist, complete with lines like, "The world doesn't understand me, and I'll show them all." I tried to nod politely, but he kept stopping to ask, "What do you think? Is this powerful enough?" When I suggested we talk about something else, he sighed and said, "It's okay if you don't get it. Not everyone appreciates real art." I finished my drink quickly and left, wishing I'd brought a notebook of my own to make an exit plan. Story 64. He invited me to an escape room for our first date, which I thought was a creative idea. But as soon as we started, he took over completely. "I've done these before," he said, waving me away when I tried to examine a clue. "Just let me handle it." He spent the next 30 minutes barking orders and getting visibly frustrated whenever I suggested something. At one point, when I tried to unlock a box, he said, "No offense, but you're slowing us down." By the time we finally escaped, he was sweaty and triumphant, acting like he'd just solved world peace. As we left, he said, "You're not bad, but you need to work on your puzzle skills." I told him I'd pass on a second date and headed home. Story 65. We met for coffee at a cute local spot, and everything seemed fine, until I mentioned I had a pet cat. "Oh no," he said, his face falling. "I'm allergic." I told him it wasn't a problem since we were at a neutral location, but he shook his head. "It's not just physical, it's emotional," he said. He then launched into a long story about how his ex had a cat that ruined their relationship. "Every time I tried to get close, the cat would stare at me like it knew I wasn't welcome," he said. "I don't think I can ever trust someone who chooses a cat over a person." When I mentioned that I wasn't planning to choose between him and my cat after one date, he sighed and said, "It's just a red flag for me." I finished my coffee quickly and left, making a mental note to hug my cat when I got home. Edit. Too long. Didn't read. These dates included a food critic who ate bland meals, a trivia tyrant, an aspiring screenwriter, a bossy escape room expert, and a man emotionally scarred by cats. First dates are a gamble, and I keep losing.